Welcome to Heresy, the Horus Heresy talk show. In this video, we're going to be talking about the Word Bearers, their unique units, and also their rights of war. We're going to be covering their 3 specialist unique units in depth. We're going to be talking about what armies you can build with the rights of war and what they will do for your force. This is part 2 of the Word Bearers series, so special characters and also army suggestions, etc. will be covered in future episodes. And if you've not seen part 1 yet about the armory, I'd suggest you go back and give that a look. But before we go into the episode, if you enjoy the content, please do leave me a like or subscribe. And if you've got any comments or any feedback at all on the episode, please leave them in the YouTube comments below. And now, on with the show. So the first unit we're going to take a look at, and probably the most classic, archetypical unit people think of when they think of Word Bearers, is the Gal Vorbak squad. Now, the Gal Vorbak are a unit of 5 big guys who are really good in combat, so they sort of fill the same niche or role as melee Terminator units do, but they do it in quite a different way, really, when you look at the stats. So they have got a very powerful stat line. They're move 8, which makes them fast and means they get that +1 to the charge roll. They're initiative 5, which means they're going to strike before most things in combat. And they're also 3 wounds each, which makes them very tough. Because of the toughness 5 as well, they are immune to most common instant death weapons. So most things like Thunderhammers or Power Fists, or even Dreadnought Fists, although not Leviathan Dreadnought Fist, won't instant death them, which is huge because it makes their wounds a lot more valuable than the wounds on a toughness 4 Terminator. It also means they get to use their Feel No Pain against a lot of guns as well. So las cannons would normally kill a Terminator. For these guys, they still get their Feel No Pain save as well. So that's quite a big deal. When comparing them to Terminators against low AP weapons, so if you're going to try and shoot these down with bolters or something like that, they've got a similar defensive profile. In terms of the save and throw, they've got a 3+ and then a Feel No Pain. Whereas the Terminator's got a 2+, which is a bit better. But obviously the Gal Vorbak generally come off better because of their +1 toughness anyway, so they're tougher in that regard too. They do lose the ability to have an Apothecary or a Primus Medicae in the unit, as other elite units, depending on their armor type, would have, because they've already got Feel No Pain, so they don't get any benefit there. But overall, very tough and a very good stat line. So what else do they do? Well, they're corrupted units by default, which means they've got a fear aura, but does mean that they take instant death from psychic weapons, so generally very good, especially considering that they can take a Warp Fire Blaster in the unit, so they get that 1 plasma gun equivalent with pinning as well, which you're going to be able to leverage that fear for to pin enemy units, and a lot of the time that might be pinning a unit before you charge, so it can't overwatch you, which is really good. They've also got 5 attacks, potentially, these guys on the charge. So with the rage on the charge, the 3 base attacks, they're going to be throwing 5 attacks out each, which is very good. And it does mean that if you choose to take the Power Fist in the unit, which I think I always would on the one guy, just to give you that guaranteed AP2 and that guaranteed Strength 8 and possibly instant death against a lot of targets, you get a lot of value out of it, because most of the time when you buy a Power Fist, it's on a guy with 2 or 3 attacks. In this case, it's 5, which is really good. The Tainted Talons that they've got are a really good weapon. So they rend and Murderer strike on a 6, and they're only strength user. So they are pretty good at killing normal Marines. You know, they're AP3 strength user. They're going to kill lots of normal Marines because these guys have got strength 5 anyway. That's no problem. But with Rendon and Murderer strike, that's very powerful against other elite infantry. Obviously, it's only on a 6, but these guys do have a lot of attacks. It's 25 attacks on the unit when they charge, and it really does make you need to leverage that. Like, it's quite important, more important than with a lot of units that these guys do get that charge. And obviously, you've got to be careful for the enemy holding the line against that dude, though, which does mean they don't get to overwatch you, but does take a lot of your power away. So that's really what you're aiming for, volume of attacks to get those 6 wounds through, and in that case, Gal Vorbak will kill most enemy elite units quite handily, especially because they've got initiative 5 as well. Now, they don't have a dedicated transport option, so a heavy support Land Raider, particularly when they're available in plastic, will be a really good thing for these guys. You do ideally want to deliver them into battle, although with movement 8, and because they are quite tough, I do think, particularly if you run multiple units of these, you could legitimately run them across the battlefield as well. That's what I'm planning to do, certainly in my smaller early armies for Word Bearers. Characters are quite good in these units as well, because, you know, characters want to be in elite melee units, but you do have to bear in mind that you're going to reduce the unit's move by most characters, especially if it's a Cataphracte Armored Terminator. I would generally recommend against that, though, because you do want these guys to keep the ability to sweep. So a lot of the time you're going to be putting a Tartaros armored guy in this unit, which is what I'm doing. It'll reduce their move a little bit. You do also need that model to be corrupted as well, so it's more points to spend on the character to corrupt them to make sure this unit's getting the corruption bonus. But they function just fine without a character, and they will kill a lot of things, characters included, quite happily with this profile they've got. Overall, a really strong unit, just very, very solid stat line. They're pretty much good at killing everything. They do lose a lot of their power if they don't get their rage charge bonus, so that is a thing that you want to play around as much as you can. I wouldn't recommend putting any weapons on them other than the Warpfire Blaster just because it's so good with pinning, but these guys are very, very powerful and very, very scary to play against just because they're good against so much stuff. You know, even if they come in contact with the Dreadnought, that instant death Rendon profile and all those attacks and the fact they attack before Dreadnoughts as well makes them pretty good Dreadnought killers too. So big thumbs up on Gal Vorbak, and definitely a unit you will see a lot if you play against Wordbearers. Next we've got Ashen Circle. Now I have to admit, the reason I'm recording this video before some other videos I've got in the queue is mostly because I want to talk about these guys because I just love them so much. Now firstly, when you look at them, 125 points for their basic stat line, which is effectively a Marine with +1 attack, is not actually that exciting. And 125 points for a 1 wound model with a 3+ save, generally you look at that and say, that's a bit expensive. It sort of doesn't matter what some units do if they're so fragile. But I think these guys do actually do enough to make up for that drawback. So they've got Flamers with Torrent 6. Now Torrent is obviously good for increasing the range of your Flamer, especially since it means you can maybe land outside of movement reaction distance and still shoot people with your Flamers, which is really good. But what it's really good for is making sure you get the right angles with Flamers. Now, although Flamers can easily get lots of hits, sometimes your opponent or your position or whatever can mean they get lost hits. Torrent basically fixes all of that. Torrent just lets you put perfect Flamer templates down almost every time. And these Flamers also pin, which is super good. And they're AP4 as well, which does mean against some targets potentially in the future you're going to be killing units where a normal Flamer might give the opponent a save. Now just these Flamers on a unit with jump packs is pretty good on its own because Flamers can be very devastating when they get close, and these guys have got Torrent, they don't need to go as close, and they're very fast. That's a pretty good unit on its own, and if we stop there with Ashen Circle, I do think they'd be pretty playable just because of how good that is. But Ashen Circle don't stop there, they just keep piling on the stuff. So they've got really good melee weapons, AP3, +1 strength, so they're striking at strength 5 and shred. So once you hit with these guys, they're going to wound almost all the time, 8 out of 9 times against the Space Marine. They've got 2 attacks base, these guys, as well. So 5 of these guys is putting out 11 attacks or 16 attacks on the charge with that profile, which means most of the time you're going to kill 7 or 8 Space Marines just with that, which is a really powerful weapon. But on top of that as well, they've got the Crusader rule. So if they do win that combat, which they will quite a lot, they've got a great chance of sweeping people. Also, they come with Melter Bombs. So if you're not charging Space Marines and you're charging Dreadnoughts maybe, although they're less good at that, or vehicles, that's a lot of Melter Bombs. That's 5 Melter Bombs against your average vehicle. Now, most vehicles will explode from that as well. And remember, 5 of these guys is only 125 points. So against most vehicles, if they blow up the vehicle and then all die in the explosion or to shoot in the turn after, they've probably still done a good job. So that's a really good thing as well. But they also get Hammer of Wrath at +1 strength and 2 hits per model. So 5 of these guys charging is 10 Hammer of Wrath attacks, which means you're going to wound 6 or 7 times against Space Marines, and they're going to fail 2 or 3 saves. So that's more free kills. They're also stubborn too. So leadership 9 with the Sergeant or 8 normally, which is better than your average Marine profile. And they're not going to take modifiers to that for the great majority of things. Just a really good all-round profile, really good, all-round ability to fight whatever you want to fight, really. In terms of upgrading them, I would always take the Artificer Armor just because the models are so expensive and it's so great just to have a little bit of extra survivability in the unit. Not too many other upgrades though. The Inferno Pistol, whilst it's good, is expensive. And realistically, you can just Melter Bomb things. So getting 1 extra Melter shot in at a 3-inch range is not super good. And against enemy troops, you would rather have the Hand Flamer rather than the Inferno Pistol most of the time, especially for the range, so I think I would dodge that. And really, I wouldn't upgrade these guys too much. Adding extra bodies to the unit is good, especially given how limited your elite slot potential is in these armies, and we'll talk about that a bit more as the episode goes on. But sometimes they're going to be suiciding. You know, if they're going to shoot their flamers into a heavy support squad that might shoot back at them, you might lose the whole unit, and you'll lose the whole unit whether it's 5 or 8 or 10 guys sometimes. And the same if you jump into the open to melt a bomb. A tank, 5 melter bombs is probably enough to kill a tank. Any more is overkill, and then they'll still die. So whilst making the unit bigger is good, you do have to consider whether you really need to do that a lot of the time. Corrupted on these guys could be nice, because you get fear for their pinning checks with their flamers, and it means they're, you know, even more likely to win combats against other units. I would only spend 25 points on making them corrupted though if the unit's on the larger side, but it is something worth considering. Because they have bitter duty, another upgrade sort of for the unit would be a Moritat with a pair of warp fire pistols, which will contribute to the pinning for the unit and certainly to its killing power. But alternatively, it lets them be a bodyguard to the Moritat, and you probably want to separate before they fire. So the Moritat can go with them up the battlefield, maybe in one turn, and on turn 2 he can leave the unit. These guys can go and pin something. Maybe the Moritat can go and shoot something and kill a bunch of other Marines, or pin something else, which is a good thing. There's not many ways to get Moritat good bodyguards. And finally, as a jump pack unit, they can also deep strike, of course, if the situation favours it. Now, most of the time against most armies, you don't want to deep strike a single unit, but sometimes you might come across people who've not got the augury scanners in their list, or who are playing things that aren't so good at interceptor, and you might choose to deep strike these guys on occasion when the situation's favourable for it. So the biggest thing for Ashen Circle really is they're capable of tackling most targets in multiple ways, which is really good. The only thing they're not really good against is Dreadnoughts, and even Dreadnoughts, if it's a larger unit, the Dreadnought will kill 2 or 3 Ashen Circle probably quite easily before you go, but then you're going to slam a lot of melter bombs into the Dreadnought after that, so larger units still good at killing Dreadnoughts as well. Keeping them alive is really the tricky part for this unit. Now, you might not always need to keep them alive, because a lot of the time, even though they're 125 points, the sheer amount of damage they can do will often mean that as long as they get one good shooting phase or one good melter bomb charge off, if they die after that, they've probably made their points back anyway. But if you do manage to keep them alive just by good positioning or by supporting them with other units to the point where you get to use them multiple times in a game, you're going to be really in the money. Getting them to get the first shooting attack off might be hard sometimes. So depending on the board you're playing, they're probably going to need one turn of movement up the board, not doing anything before they get their chance to strike. And that's the time when you really need to either use cover, use their maneuverability, or just give your opponent scarier things to shoot at to make them get there in one piece. As an example of how powerful these guys are, if you shoot a bunch of enemy Marines and then charge them with Hammer of Wrath, and then fight with Axe Rakes, if you've got 5 of these men doing that, and you hit about 10 people with the Flamers, this kills about 18 or 19 Marines. That's between the Flamers, then the Hammer of Wrath charge, and then the Axe Rakes as well. That's a lot for 125 points in terms of killing power. The main thing that is going to stop you doing that against any unit that you fight is going to be reactions. You know, if you flamer an enemy heavy support squad, they're probably going to kill you all in return. If you charge an enemy squad with any kind of decent guns, they're probably going to overwatch you, etc. So you do have to be careful you're playing around reactions, and often this will limit the use of this unit. But it does mean that if your opponent's using reactions on this, they're not using them somewhere else, and you factor that into the way you play your whole army. But the point here is just to be clear on just how good these guys are, particularly at killing anything in power armor. As I mentioned earlier, firing pinning flamers is good enough on its own in a lot of ways for this unit. If you can just flame an expensive enemy unit, whether that's 20 Marines or whether that's 10 heavy support squad or 10 tactical support squad, that will normally be enough for this unit to be useful. If it gets to do more than that, that's gravy, And if you can do that from somewhere that's relatively safe, whether that's from a position where your opponent can't see them with tons of guns on their next turn, or whether because you're doing it from near other troops of yours that are supporting because they have got a long range on them flamers, that's a good way to make sure your enemy at least has to put some effort in to kill them and doesn't get to kill them for free. That's what we're going for. As I mentioned earlier, at least suiciding them into enemy tanks will make their points back anyway, so that's certainly a thing they can do. But for me overall, Ashen Circle are just really fun. There's so much stuff they can do, and the way you play them will really determine how good or less good they are. And your opponent's got lots to think about when Ashen Circle are on the table as well, because they could go for any target, conceivably, and they're really going to distract your opponent. You know, your opponent does need to kill them quickly so that they don't get to do their thing twice or 3 times and keep, killing your enemy units. So your opponent is going to have to put some effort and firepower or whatever else to getting rid of them. And that can be a great thing that gives you an opportunity to get your Galvor back or your other things up the table while your enemy's busy dealing with your Ashen Circle squads. The biggest drawback to them for me is I would like to run multiple small Ashen Circle squads and that really chews up your elite slots very quickly, because all of the units that Wordbearers get access to in the elite slot are all very good. And so these compete with your other things like the Galvorbach and the Marigal Dreadnought, which we're about to talk about. So that's definitely a balance act in your army building. Speaking of the Marigal Dreadnought, it's another fantastic piece for Wordbearers. So it's got weapon skill 6, which on its own is just huge. It means that against enemy elite Terminators, they're hitting him on a 5, he's hitting them on a 3. But he's also got initiative 5. He moves 8 and he's got Pathfinder and move through cover, so he gets around some of the drawbacks that other melee dreadnoughts have got as well. Then he's got 8 wounds and it will not die. He's very tough. He's also got Shroud of Dark Fire, which is the same as an Atomantic Deflector, but also gives -1 strength to a bunch of weapons, the main ones being Plasma and Melter. So although Melter guns will be wounding them on a 3 default, they're going to be wounding them on a 4 with their reroll if they're on Armor Bane range, which is, as an Iron Hands player, I can tell you that's very powerful. And having it on the main weapons that affect the Dreadnought or that people will kill a Dreadnought with is really, really good. And he's only 240 points. So as Dreadnoughts go for his toughness and his stat line, he's not really that expensive. His claws are only Brutal 2. I say only Brutal 2 is still very good, but compared to a normal Dreadnought's claws, which are Brutal 3. But he's got Murderous Strike on a 5+, which is a good trade-up. It makes him very good at killing enemy Dreadnoughts, because he gets that Murderous Strike off for extra damage. And it also does mean that if he fights things that he couldn't normally Murderous Strike, so you do come across things with Eternal Warrior or Battle Hardened when you're fighting a lot of enemy things with Dreadnoughts, it means he can still Murderous Strike things that his strength alone won't allow him to. Now the Warfire Cannon is a good option. It's only Ballistic Skill 3, so a little bit less accurate than on your average Dreadnought, but it is good to kill Marines, and obviously it does mean it's another source of pinning for your army. Now the cost of that is a few extra points, but you lose the attack for having 2 weapons, which is quite a big deal when you think about how powerful the individual attacks on this Dreadnought are. But he does have Rampage 2. He's going to get 6 attacks on the charge if he gets his Rampage off anyway, so losing one of them is maybe not as bad as it would otherwise feel. I do think the Warfire Cannon's a good option, but I think you could go with that or Double Claws would both be fine. The big thing you have to watch out for on this Dreadnought, the same as the Galvorbach, is enemy holding the line, which will deny you 3 attacks on the charge, which is a lot of attacks to lose with a model that's so powerful. The upside is that other parts of your army have the same problem as well, and if the opponent's only got 1 assault phase reaction, he's not going to be able to hold the line everywhere. And your units do cause fear, which means that when your opponent takes those hold the line tests, he's going to be at -1 to them as well. So that's a little bit of a mitigation. The biggest actual drawback to the Marigal is that he can't really support your other corrupted units due to Accursed, so he debuffs their strength and toughness when he's too close to them, and your Psykers as well. But what you can do is you can have Marigals work in pairs, because they don't affect each other, or you can have them support your non-corrupted units as well. So if you're taking, say, a big unit of Tactical Marines, or you've got some other things that you've decided not to corrupt, he can support those without any adverse effects. His explosion radius from his Shroud of Dark Fire is D6 plus 6 inches though, which is a lot bigger than your average explosion. So if you are going to support a big unit of Space Marines or something uncorrupted with him, just watch out for him exploding, and taking a lot of your units with him as well could be a problem. Ultimately though, at 240 points, really cheap for what you get, actually. He's closer to a Leviathan in power than a normal Dreadnought in my opinion, but obviously he comes with some drawbacks. He can't come in a Talon, which means that you're only getting 1 of them in a slot. So if you do want to take multiple again, you're eating up those elite slots and competing with the other units. So you've really got to think about that when you're making your army. So with those units looked at, let's have a look at the Rites of War. So firstly, we've got the Dark Brethren. This lets you designate a unit as a target effectively, and if it dies, if it gets sacrificed to the Dark Gods, you get a buff on one of your units. Pretty easy to achieve against most armies. If you want to kill a specific unit, As long as it's not a super tough unit that your opponent's got, you'll generally be able to do that if you want to focus your fire. You can expect to fail this on turn 1 probably fairly often, especially when you factor in things like night fighting as well. So most turns you're going to be doing this are going to be turn 2 onwards, but that's okay. You really want to pick units your opponent can't afford to hide. So if you pick a unit of 10 tactical marines for this, your opponent could just hide them behind a building, and that will mean it's going to be very hard for you to do this or pick other targets because you won't get to remove them and that kind of stuff. So you want to pick units your opponent can't afford to hide. So things like heavy support squads that your opponent's paid maybe 250 points for are a great target because your opponent can't keep them out of line of sight without just not using them, in which case you're winning anyway. But you also don't want them to be too tough. Obviously, you don't want to pick a big unit of tooled up Terminators with a Primus Medica and a bunch of buffs for this because you're not going to kill them either. Now, the buff itself is huge. I can't state enough times how good +1 weapon skill is, but this is also +1 strength and movement as well. Even if you only triggered this once a game on one unit, it'd be a big deal, but you're going to trigger it lots of times, and you can stack it if you want as well onto the same unit. It's really good on Gal Vorbak, taking them up to that Holy Grail weapon skill 6, giving them strength 6 for their base attacks with their claws, wounding most things on a 2, and also another point of movement to get them there as well. But even Ashen Circle, for example, Ashen Circle charge into combat, people will hit them back less because they got weapon skill 5, makes them even more likely to wound with that shred as well. Any melee unit at all, even a tooled up unit of tactical marines with chain bayonets suddenly going to weapon skill 5, strength 6 and an extra point of movement, which would give them +1 to charge. It's such a good buff. It's such a big buff. And pulling this off multiple times a game is really going to supercharge one or more of your units. Like most things that say they affect a unit, a little bit unclear on how this works on characters. So if you pick a unit with an independent character in it, does it also buff the independent character? I would err on the side of no for that for now, personally, unless you're playing against Imperial Fists who do similar with Phalanx Warders, which I think is silly, in which case I'd play it like you do. It's really up to you and your opponent how you decide to do that. But for me, I don't think this buff should apply to a character joined to a unit as well. The failure case for this is when you don't kill a unit. So you have to take Perils of the Warp in your army if you don't kill a unit. And as I say, that is going to happen on turn 1 a bit, but it's not too big of a problem. To make sure that you don't fail, you don't want to be running an all-melee Wordbearers army. Bringing guns is generally an idea. So you want to make sure that you've got long-range guns in the army so you can pick off those units that you need to kill to trigger this. Consider some no-line-of-sight weapons as well. Generally good support for most armies anyway. Things like a Scorpius, just in case your opponent does try to hide things. And alternatively, assassin-style units like Ashen Circle or a Moritat, which can sort of go where they want even if your opponent's trying to avoid you, are also really good for triggering this as well. It is traitor only, which doesn't really make a huge difference, I don't think, since most people will be playing Dark Brethren, Wordbearers, for the full Chaos experience. Very narratively cool, this. Sacrificing enemies to the Dark Gods, as well as getting real powerful buffs off it from the same time. I really want to use this in every Wordbearers army. I will struggle certainly for a long time to consider any Rite of War other than this, just because of how cool it is, as well as how powerful it is. The other option Wordbearers do have is Last of the Serrated Sun. So this makes Gal Vorbak troops, but not line. But that really does help with the elite slot starvation that this army has. It's got so much cool stuff in the elite slots that if you use Gal Vorbak as troops, it frees all those slots up for other things that we've talked about. If you choose not to use, you can use them as compulsory troops. It doesn't say non-compulsory. And if you choose not to fill those troop slots with something that is line, you can use Argyle Tal. You can also use Heralds or Retinues to make up for the loss of line in your army if you're only going to take Gal Vorbak in those troop slots, which I think is a cool way to build this. You also get access to Dreadclaw drop pods for your Gal Vorbak, which is cool because they don't normally have a dedicated transport, although those drop pods are quite expensive and not actually that tough or hard for your opponent to destroy, but is an interesting option, whether you deep strike them or just fly them around the battlefield as well. That can be quite cool. All units with Rhinos can also take drop pods instead, so you can make a fully drop army out of this if you want to. Again, it's traitor only, and it can't be an ally or be allied with. Basically, you have got a good right here if you want to get round the elite slot issue to play all the different elites in the Wordbearers army. If you really want to play lots of Gal Vorbak and you still want to be able to get things like Marigal, Ashen Circle or other elite units in your army, this is a good way to enable you to build it. So in summary for Word Bearers, they've got powerful elite units. All of their elite slots are really good, and they also add great flavour to the army. You know, the Corrupted Dreadnought, the Corrupted Marines, as well as the Iconoclastic Ashen Circle as well. All great flavour for the army too, which is lovely. Limited by your elite slot availability, so Marigal only coming as a 1, not a Talon. Ashen Circle really wanting to be in multiple slots and multiple squads does limit your ability to do all of this at once, which is a bit of a shame because I'd really like to do it all at once. But there's certainly some options for how you build your army there. And I think finally, it's worth calling out just how powerful the Dark Brethren Rite of War is. There's not many Rites of War in the game that have massive impacts on your army. Lots of them change the way your army is built and give you some reasonably decent buffs. This is a huge buff. And it's also very good and flavoursome as well. It's great all around, so it's a super win for Word Bearers. And that's the end of the show. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have, please do leave me a like and a subscribe. And if you've got any comments at all, please drop them down below on YouTube. Do look out for the next parts of this Word Bearers review that will be coming in the near future as well. Thanks for listening, and bye-bye.